and welcome to Afternoon Briefing. I'm Jane Norman. Coming up, questions of integrity once again in the spotlight. Australia Post boss Christine Holgate has quit over the luxury watches scandal. But first, here are the top stories we're following this afternoon. The Attorney-General announces the details of the long-awaited federal anti-corruption watchdog with greater powers than a royal commission. Deb Frecklington resigns as Queensland opposition leader after the LNP's election defeat. Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers is my guest today. And as US election day looms, Donald Trump and Joe Biden continue a campaign blitz through several battleground states. We'll be crossing to Washington later in the hour. Well, nearly 2 years after he promised a federal anti-corruption watchdog, Attorney-General Christian Porter has finally unveiled draft legislation to set up a new Commonwealth Integrity Commission. It'll have extraordinary powers to investigate corruption across the public sector, as well as parliamentarians and their staff. But its remit has been limited, or will be limited, to criminal conduct. It won't be able to launch its own investigations, and it'll be holding its hearings in private.
The Commonwealth Integrity Commission, as you'll see in the legislation, will have greater powers than a Royal Commission. It will have the power to compel people to give sworn evidence at hearings, with a maximum penalty of 2 years for failure to comply. 2 years imprisonment, that is. It will have the power to compel people to provide information and produce documents, even if the information would incriminate the person, again with a maximum penalty of 2 years imprisonment for non-compliance. It'll have the power to search people in their houses or seize property under warrant. It'll have the power to arrest people. It'll have the power to intercept phone calls and use other surveillance devices to investigate persons and to confiscate people's passports by court orders. It will also have the ability, its agents, that is its officers, to assume false identities for the purposes of investigation.
Christian Porter there. Well, there's been a fair bit of breaking news this afternoon. To break it all down, I'm joined in the studio by the ABC's political editor, Andrew Probyn. Thanks for coming into the studio. Let's start first with this news about Christine Holgate, the Australia Post chief executive. Was this inevitable that she would stand down from the role?
It was inevitable as soon as Scott Morrison made that fierce attack on her, saying that if she doesn't step down, she can go. Her time effectively at Australia Post was shot. So this was coming, even though on Friday, through her lawyers, she was saying that she didn't see a reason for having well, she didn't say that she said that she hadn't done anything wrong. Now, that didn't mean, though, that her time was untenable as the Australia Post chief. Now, she says in her statement that it concedes that the Cartier watch's gift didn't pass the pub test. That's absolutely true. It was an error of judgment on behalf of her and the board. But if you look at the broad sweep of the issues that have been before Parliament, whether it comes to Senate estimate scrutiny or parliamentary broadly, that is a sin of optics more than anything else. But would she or Australia Post handling have been caught up in any of these integrity measures that we're talking about today with Christian Porter? Very unlikely. Yeah.
So, I mean, has the board escaped accountability here? Has she been? I mean, there have been accusations that she's been made the scapegoat for what was a foolish decision on the part of Australia Post.
Well, her failures are the board's failures as well. The board and Christine Holgate have got a tin ear when it comes to what's acceptable for a body like Australia Post, a government enterprise that does, well, its profits go to the taxpayer. So we as Australians, every taxpayer has an interest in the way its money is spent, and this was an appalling way to spend money. However, if these executives had been given a cash bonus for what was a very lucrative deal that they stitched up, we wouldn't be talking about it today, and Christine Holgate would still have her job.
It is very much optics, and interestingly, there's a 4-week investigation which is looking into the board, so there might be some more movement here. But before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you about today's Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Why today? Why was this announcement made today?
Well, interesting, isn't it? We've been talking about that curiously named Leppington Triangle. We've been talking in recent weeks about the ASIC chair and his deputy who are caught up in an expensive scandal, and the Australia Post aspect. These three things became a great weight on the shoulder of a government that was trying to say that the Integrity Commission could wait. But when you listen to what Christian Porter says about the powers of this Integrity Commission, they do need to take their time.
Yeah.
I mean, these are extraordinary powers, powers to not only detect, but investigate, to go undercover, to effectively pretend to be someone else, to ensnare MPs, bureaucrats, public servants. ABC, SBS going to be subject to one aspect of it, so they will hasten slowly. But you can see already that this is going to be a red-hot political argument on a couple of fronts. And the first one is the big one, and that is about public hearings.
Yep, versus private.
We now know from the Labor Party, because Mark Dreyfus, the Shadow Attorney General, has already been out. He says that he wants to have public hearings. I know that there are people inside the coalition who want to have public hearings because they argue that integrity and the pursuit of integrity needs to be seen by the public.
Yep.
And but the government's counter to that is that look at what's happened in places like New South Wales, where these show trials have destroyed careers. But then again, Gladys Berejiklian faced tremendous embarrassment, and she's still with us.
Yeah, it's interesting because Christian Porter seems adamant that they remain private, but that is clearly going to be the biggest sticking point between the Labor Party and the coalition. But Andrew Previn, we'll leave it there for now, so you can go and actually do the story for 7 p.m. tonight. We look forward to that. Well, to get some more reaction to today's news about the Commonwealth Integrity Commission, I'm joined live by Professor AJ Brown from Griffith University. Professor Brown, welcome to the program.
Afternoon, Jane.
This has been a really long time coming. You have probably just seen the announcement in the past few hours, like all of us. What do you think of the proposed new CIC?
Well, it's a very historic step, Jane, because finally we are seeing the Commonwealth moving in the course of the next 12 months to finally catch up with the states and much of the rest of the world to have a serious specialist anti-corruption agency. But as we've already been hearing, there's plenty of criticism of the model, and there's plenty of water to go under the bridge yet in establishing what would truly be a best practice commission, because this particular model and this particular bill certainly has lots and lots of challenges.
OK, well, what are the challenges that you see in this bill? We've named a couple. The fact that the hearings under this proposal would be private, the fact that it can't instigate its own investigations. Where do you see the failings here, the pitfalls?
Well, it's actually very complicated because this particular model tries to split the federal government in two parts, 80% and 20%. 20% would actually be subject to powers greater than a royal commission, including potentially public hearings. The other 80%, including big things like defence procurement, including all politicians, would be subject to these much narrower powers and only criminal offences of corruption as opposed to broader integrity issues. So in the attempt to move from the current system to a wider system that goes right across the federal government, the government's current proposal sort of falls between the two stools, really, of being strong in some respects but too weak in other respects. And that's where negotiations with the rest of the parliament and the crossbenchers are going to have to produce some kind of a compromise for something that can actually work and have the support of all sides of politics once the submissions are in on this bill.
Why do you think the government has separated the two divisions of this new proposed CIC? As you mentioned, there's the law enforcement division and then there's the public sector division covering public sector agencies, universities, parliamentarians.
Well, I think it's because it's caught between a bit of a rock and a hard place, and I think all Australians and all the other parties in Parliament need to help find a solution. And the difficulty is that the existing Law Enforcement Integrity Commission does have very strong powers and a very wide integrity remit and can take action to prevent corruption in about 20% of the federal public service. But the government is clearly very nervous about those types of public hearing powers that we've seen used at a state level, particularly in New South Wales, and doesn't want to extend them to federal politicians and the rest of the federal public service. It's going to need to, at the end of the day, for this model to have credibility, but it doesn't mean that those public hearing powers have to be used all the time, the way that some state anti-corruption bodies have used them. So there is room for a really sensible, potentially best practice compromise before this is done, where we know when we want to use public hearings and politicians and others can be more confident that the safeguards are in place to mean that those sorts of powers aren't overused. But I think everybody knows, and I think the government knows, and certainly everybody else knows, that this bill doesn't strike the balance yet, but it's still a very big historic step in the right direction because it's going to be good for Australia once that balance is struck.
Yeah, on the question of the public hearings, because this is one point that we know that the Labor Party is very strong on, the government says that public hearings in state anti-corruption bodies have resulted in multiple instances of unjust and irreparable harm to the reputations of innocent people. Do you agree with that there have been some failings of the state anti-corruption bodies?
I wouldn't describe them as failings, but I would describe it as being pretty clear that at some times, in some situations, there's been a bit of overreach. There's been a premium put on exposing corruption as opposed to necessarily investigating it in a way which would get an outcome like charges before the courts. And it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes it needs to be that way, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And that's where once the federal parliament does strike a good balance on those issues so that it gets the right safeguards in place, then it can have a body that is just as strong and just as effective as anti-corruption bodies, not just in New South Wales, but in Queensland in particular. So there is scope here for a good outcome. The type of money that the Commonwealth government is putting behind this commission is real money. And in a COVID environment, we need this sort of accountability even more, as we've seen from these recent scandals. So there really is, it really is time, but there's going to be some more work that the Parliament is going to have to do before we get that best practice model that Australia deserves.
So under this model, the government is proposing that the CIC would investigate serious criminal offences, alleged serious criminal offences. But you mentioned earlier that not all corruption is considered criminal. Can you sort of explain that? Like, do you think it's too narrow in scope to only allow this CIC to investigate potential criminal offences?
Well, it is too narrow in scope. And currently with federal law enforcement agencies, the Commission already has a wider scope. And a good example is like the Leppington Triangle with the Western Sydney airport land. When it was a conflict of interest that hadn't been disclosed, that appeared to have contaminated this with apparently some political donors in the background as vendors, no clear evidence of a criminal offence, then you would still want that thoroughly investigated, but you would need a body that could go looking at that grey area corruption in order to investigate it properly. But under this model, it could only be if there's already reasonable suspicion of a criminal offence before the investigation could commence. And so that's fine if we've got clear evidence of fraud, and some people seem to think there might be in the Leppington Triangle example. But the bottom line is that there needs to be an ability for a commission like this to start investigating in order to find out whether the matter is how serious it is, and to deal with those issues of conflict of interest, of undue influence, of failures of due process, because we don't know how wide they go. We don't know how many other agencies might be affected by the same sorts of problems. So to really command public confidence, the whole Commission needs to be able to look at that broader scope of corruption, the grey areas, not just clear criminal offences giving rise to reasonable suspicion. And it's necessary to be able to use some of those stronger, including public hearing powers. So when the balance is struck, this is not the balance yet, but when the balance is struck, we have the potential for a really good integrity commission, and that'll be good for Australia, but we're not there yet.
All right, Professor H.A. Brown, we have 6 months of public consultations to go, so we'll see whether that balance is struck at the end of that process. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks very much, Jane.
Well, over the weekend in Queensland, Labor clinched an historic third term in government with Anastasia Palaszczuk's emphatic win over her LNP rival Deb Frecklington. Despite boldly declaring on Saturday night that she'd stay on as LNP leader, Frecklington has today resigned. Let's cross now to Jessica Van Vonderen in Brisbane for the latest. Jess, did Deb Frecklington have any other choice today?
Probably not, Jane, given that the LNP failed to make any kind of dent on Labor's hold on majority. MPs have recognised the hard work that Ms Frecklington put into the campaign, but there are some question marks over a couple of policies that she took to the election, including this suggestion for a trial of a youth curfew in North Queensland to tackle crime. But what raised eyebrows the most was that declaration on Saturday night that she would stay on as leader. That has caused quite the stir, even amongst her supporters, because the LNP party room jealously guards its right to select the leadership team. So after that declaration on Saturday night at 10:30 p.m, she then spent the day with her family on Sunday, and then this morning declared that she would not be the opposition leader going forward.
I'm proud of the policies and the candidates that we put forward at this election. I'm proud of the campaign that we fought. We fought fair. I wish my successor as the leader of the Liberal National Party and opposition all the very best. While we didn't win this election, I am as determined as ever to fight on behalf of the people of Nanango and the people of Queensland.
So Deb Frecklington will call a party room meeting for a spill once all of the seats have been declared. And the two names that are consistently coming forward as possible replacements as leader is her deputy, Tim Mander, who is a Brisbane MP, as well as Gold Coast MP David Crisafulli.
All right, well, that's the LNP side, Jess. How big a majority did the Labor government actually end up with?
Yeah, so the ALP has secured 50 seats and they're ahead in another 2, so it'll be a majority of at least 4 seats. And today the Premier has staged a little meeting with her Treasurer and her Deputy Premier for the cameras to show them busily working away on the state budget, which they've announced will be handed down on the 1st of December. They've already warned that it's going to be a challenging and difficult budget, and of course the Premier's other job is to actually pick her cabinet going into this third term in office. As for the LNP, the ABC election computer is giving 30 seats away to them, but they are ahead in 4 others, and there are 7 members of the crossbench, including 2 Greens MPs in Inner Brisbane.
All right, Jess Van Vonderen, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Jane.
Jess Van Vonderen in Brisbane there. Well, for more on the Queensland election result, I'm joined now by Treasurer Jim Chalmers, whose seat of Logan is in Queensland. Jim Chalmers, welcome to the program.
G'day, Jane.
So we've now had the Northern Territory, the ACT and Queensland all return the government's basically incumbency. Are we seeing the benefits of incumbency during a pandemic, during a crisis here?
I think incumbency matters, Jane, but it's what you do with that incumbency that matters. Anastasia Palaszczuk won a stunning victory here in Queensland on the weekend, a thoroughly deserved victory which recognises that she made difficult decisions in a difficult time for our state. She was right and resolute. People rallied behind her because they understand that the best way to protect the Queensland economy is to limit the spread of the virus.
We saw during the election campaign Anastasia Palaszczuk very much stare down her critics in the South, including the Prime Minister. This has clearly sort of worked, hasn't it, by standing firm by the policies that she had implemented?
I think people recognise that she has their interests at heart. I think one of the most memorable things I've heard in politics in recent times was when she said that she'd rather lose an election than lose lives unnecessarily. And I think people really trusted her, that she meant that when she said it. People have rallied behind her in big numbers. I've been calling her the people's champion. I haven't seen a reaction to a state leader like I saw on the booths. I was on 4 different booths on Saturday, and it really was quite remarkable seeing people get around her. You mentioned Scott Morrison a moment ago. He came up here for the best part of a week He tried to pick a fight with Anastasia Palaszczuk. I think the people of Queensland resoundingly backed Anastasia in that disagreement over the borders. And I think I was listening to that footage you were playing a moment ago of Deb Frecklington. I think it is the case that Scott Morrison did Deb Frecklington no favours by being here and by the way he conducted himself when he was here.
One of the more interesting aspects of this result was how the minor parties fared, and One Nation suffered a massive swing and only held on to one of its seats. I mean, this is home turf for the One Nation party. Do you think we're seeing the kind of beginning of the end for that party in Queensland?
Oh, look, it certainly warmed the heart to see One Nation's vote effectively collapse. It was also terrific to see, despite millions of dollars thrown at this election on behalf of the LNP by Clive Palmer, to see him barely register on the counting on election night. But I think it would be premature to write off the role of minor parties like One Nation. Unfortunately, they've been part of the furniture in the political system now since the 1990s. And so I think it would be premature to say that it's the end of One Nation. Ideally, that would be the case. We don't need more of their divisive brand of politics. You know, and so it was heartening to see the way that Queenslanders didn't support them in great numbers at the last election, but let's see what happens into the future.
Well, Queensland has obviously massively got behind Labor because the primary vote for Queensland Labor is around 40% now, which is, you know, a really significant chunk of the vote. What lessons can federal Labor learn from this?
Well, I think you're right. That is a pretty remarkable result, given how many candidates and how many parties were contesting this election. I think the lesson for federal Labor is that there are people in communities right throughout Queensland, not just in the southeast corner, who are open-minded about supporting the Labor Party. If we get the message right and we get the policies right, there's nothing to say that we can't do much better at the federal level than we have been. We absolutely must do better than we have been. I've been in the Labor Party now for 23 or 24 years. We've only really done well at the federal level in one election in that entire period, and that was 2007 under Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan. And so we need to recognise that there are votes there. There are people willing to support us, but we've got to have to get everything absolutely right. And that's what Anastasia Palaszczuk was able to do, and that's what we need to do.
Federally, Labor has done, well, in particularly the last election, did pretty poorly sort of outside Brisbane. There aren't too many regional Labor representatives now federally in Queensland. What do you think of the policies that Anastasia Palaszczuk had that appealed to people in those sort of regional central Queensland northern areas?
Oh, I think she had a laser-like focus on jobs, which is what we are doing at the federal level as well. And also to recognise that Queensland isn't one big economy. It's a series of regional, local communities and economies, and to make sure that you have a policy offering which is relevant to every part of the community. I think if you take one example, one thing that's common between what Anastasia Palaszczuk is talking about and Anthony Albanese is reviving the train manufacturing industry in parts of regional Queensland. That's a good example of the types of practical, down-to-earth, jobs-focused policies that we need to be on about. People are prepared to support that if we get those policies right, and that's what we intend to do.
All right, let's just move on to some other news that's broken this afternoon. And the Australia Post Chief Executive Christine Holgate has resigned. Of course, she was forced to stand aside pending an investigation, but she's now gone over the luxury watches scandal. Is this an appropriate course of action for her?
Oh, look, clearly there was what went on at Australia Post wasn't something that we're prepared to support. But I think it's also true that Christine Holgate, having taken this decision, still doesn't resolve, I think, the two main underlying issues at Australia Post. First one is the way that services have been wound back with Scott Morrison's support. This doesn't change that. And secondly, the way that the executive hasn't been properly overseen by a board which is stacked with Liberal Party mates. And so Christine Holgate's departure, whatever people think about her and what's gone on with these $20,000 worth of watches, I think we can agree that those two underlying issues are still in place. The other really important issue, Jane, is this. If Christine Holgate is hounded out for $20,000 in luxury watches by the Prime Minister, What does that now mean for Scott Morrison's own ministers who've been sprung paying $30 million to a Liberal donor for a $3 million parcel of land? What does it mean for sports rorts and regional rorts and doctored documents? All of these sorts of things that Morrison government ministers have been caught red-handed doing but remain in their jobs while Christine Holgate is hounded out of hers. What we ask from the Prime Minister is that he apply the same standards to his own ministers that he's applied to Ms Holgate in this, on this occasion.
Yeah, we'll get on to the national integrity issue in just a moment, but just to finish off with Australia Post, is it fair that Christine Holgate has taken the fall here though? Because you've mentioned the board, there is an investigation underway which takes in the board's role here. Would you expect possibly changes to be made once that investigation comes back?
Oh, well, clearly we need to think more broadly about all of the underlying issues at Australia Post. And as I said, clearly the board has not done an effective job overseeing some of this behaviour. Clearly some of the cutbacks in services that have been instituted with Scott Morrison's support are not consistent with servicing the community to a standard that the community has a right to expect. And so there are issues there. The inquiry no doubt will look at some but not all of those. The point that we are making is that Christine Holgate's departure doesn't solve those underlying issues. But also, if that's the standard that's been set here, $20,000 of watches, what does that mean for ministers caught paying 10 times the value of land near Western Sydney Airport to Liberal Party donors? We need to apply these sorts of standards equally.
Yeah, which brings us very neatly to the draft legislation that's been released this afternoon into a new Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Now, I don't expect that you necessarily have had time to read through the details of the legislation, but on first glance, is this the kind of federal anti-corruption watchdog that Labor has been calling for?
Well, at first glance, Jane, it looks weak, it looks secretive, and it looks compromised. My colleague Mark Dreyfus has made our initial views known on the draft that's been released today. The government's been sitting on this draft since December. They've been saying for years now that they believed in a National Integrity Commission while sitting on their hands and trying to delay its implementation. So you're right, we will go through the detail of it. My colleagues, the legal eagles like Mark Dreyfus and others, will go through all of the detail, but at first blush, it does look weak and secretive and compromised. And unfortunately, when you join the dots between what the government is attempting to do here and what they've been doing with the Auditor General as well, we need a strong and independent National Integrity Commission. We need a strong and independent Auditor General. And all of the government's actions in recent times have sought to diminish those two important things.
All right, Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for your time. Well, in less than 48 hours, Americans will go to the polls in perhaps the most consequential presidential election ever in the United States. Opinion polls suggest Joe Biden maintains a narrow lead over Donald Trump, but both men have set a frenetic pace in their final few days of campaigning.
You know what would have been really nice, though? If our Supreme Court could have ruled that everything has to be counted by the evening of our election, our great election day. Wouldn't that be nice? Instead of waiting around 6 days, 8 days, 9 days, giving them more time. If they want more time, let them put their ballots in early.
We have to vote like we never did before. Every day. Every day is a new reminder of how high the stakes are, of how far the other side will go to try to suppress the turnout. 90 million people have already voted. Already voted. They've had enough.
Maya King is a politics reporter at Politico and she's been covering the 2020 presidential campaign. I caught up with her just a short time ago. Maya King, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Look, the opinion polls are still pointing to a Joe Biden victory. Have they been changing much in these last few days of the campaign?
Well, they've been tightening in a few key states. So folks have really had their eyes on Pennsylvania, which is a state that we know will really decide this election because it's vacillated between going for Democrats or Republicans each year, has a large share of electoral votes, and is really a key state for Joe Biden or Donald Trump to win in order to win the presidency. And the same is true of Florida, which is less a battleground state for the Biden campaign, but still extremely important. And the polls among a number of groups at the margins, specifically African-American voters and immigrant voters in Florida, have tightened tremendously. We've seen groups start to deflect actually towards Donald Trump and away from Joe Biden. And that's given Democrats in that state a little bit of anxiety now looking ahead to Tuesday.
And why do you think the polls have started to tighten in those states in favour of Donald Trump? Is it because people are really considering now who actually to vote for, given Election Day is just a few days away?
I think it's more a lag in the data. We've seen historic turnout in this country among a number of key groups. Young voters and voters of color and first-time voters have really stormed the polls now in the weeks leading up to November 3rd. And a number of those groups are groups that tend to vote Democratic. And so the polls coming out early in this season were really reflective of a Democratic victory very early on. But the closer we get to Tuesday, we've seen more Republicans and people who make up Trump's base heading to the polls and also taking to the streets to show enthusiasm for the president's reelection campaign. And that's reflected now in the numbers out of these states.
Yeah, we know back in 2016, most of the pollsters and pundits failed to predict a Donald Trump victory. Why should we have any more confidence this time around in the polling that we're seeing?
Well, now, even as a journalist, I look at the polling and take it with a grain of salt because it looks as though Joe Biden is ahead nationally by about 7 points on average. But Democrats that I've spoken to have all said the polls are really just to guide thinking, but they are anticipating a much closer race. There's a level of understanding with polling that, again, it's really more of a reminder, an idea of how the race is going. But there are a number of voters who are called who were just really not sure which way they're going to go. And so there is reason to trust them in terms of guiding our reporting and understanding where to go and how to look at this race. But we know, thinking about 2016, that looking ahead to Tuesday, we will know the final answer when it comes and not necessarily when the polls tell us.
And just to focus on Joe Biden for a moment, he's a Democratic challenger. How do his prospects look at this point in the campaign compared to Hillary Clinton's at this point in the campaign back in 2016?
In 2016, we saw about a 5-point lead between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This year, we're seeing about a 7 to 10-point lead, and that's a pretty big difference, especially when we're thinking about electoral votes. So we are pretty confident, Democrats and Republicans, that Joe Biden can win the popular vote. But whether or not he can clear a wide enough margin to secure the electoral votes that he needs in order to take the presidency is something that is still up in the air. However, Democrats do have reason to be optimistic, understanding that even if the polls do fail us on Tuesday or don't accurately predict the state of the race, the wider margin that Joe Biden holds compared to 2016 is a good sign that this really might be an accurate prediction of victory for Democrats on Tuesday.
We've seen Barack Obama out on the campaign trail with Joe Biden in recent days. I think it might be the first time during the presidential campaign they have been campaigning alongside each other. What does that make you think about the campaign? Is it that Joe Biden needs a bit of a star factor for these last few days?
It is, and he needs a level of star. He needs that star factor with key groups of voters, and Black men are really the group that Democrats and Republicans are going after. In 2016, a large number of African-American men either voted for a third-party candidate or stayed home and had a really large level of apathy for Democratic politics. And so this year, Democrats see that group, one, as something that's ripe for Republicans to try to take some support from in order to secure a victory for Donald Trump. And so they feel like with the deployment of former President Obama to key cities and states, especially cities that have large African-American populations, that can really start to sway these voters to say, not only am I going to go to the polls and vote, but I'm going to vote for Joe Biden this year.
We've seen a massive number of Americans vote before Election Day. I think the latest stats are that 90 million voters have already cast their ballots out of a eligible 200 million. So that's nearly half of all American voters have cast their ballot. What do you think, what impact do you think that might actually have on the result? Are there still that many undecided voters?
Well, about 96% of Americans have been decided about who they're going to vote for, and that's a margin that is higher than it's been in a number of previous elections. And we're looking at really higher turnout levels than President Obama's first election, which is absolutely historic, particularly among young voters, voters of color, and first-time voters. And those are all groups that tend to vote Democratic. So it's a good sign, again, for the Biden campaign that they might be able to win decisively in this election, barring any significant developments or efforts to disenfranchise these voters.
Is this election a policy contest, or do you think it's more a referendum on Donald Trump's first term as president?
I think it's the latter. I believe it's a referendum mainly on Donald Trump's first term as president and mainly on his handling of the coronavirus that has absolutely ravaged this country across communities. So that's really front of mind for American voters, but they are also thinking about policy. And they understand that 4 more years of Donald Trump versus 4 more years of Biden will have two very, very different realities, really, as it relates to policy decisions. And so in terms of the economy, getting folks back to work, healthcare, and just the preservation of American systems, those are the policies that Americans are thinking about. But I believe front of mind for a number of voters in this election, especially those that have never voted democratically before, who have now decided to elect Joe Biden, it's very much a referendum on Donald Trump's handling of this crisis.
And there's been a lot of talk about a possible contested result. And Donald Trump told reporters today he doesn't think it's fair that we'll have to wait for a long period of time after the election to determine who has won. He said, we're going in on the night. As soon as the election is over, we're going in with our lawyers. Now, I think he was talking specifically about Pennsylvania, but what is he actually talking about here?
It's hard to tell, honestly, but what it sounds like is the threat of him, illegitimately claiming victory on election night, which would not only frighten a lot of folks, but really confuse them. And so now those of us in the media here, folks who are in positions of state power and polling, elections officials, are all now trying to consolidate together to have a plan to let Americans know that it's very common not to have a result of the election on election night, and it's happened in previous elections. And so the president has made a lot of these claims that seem, of course, authoritative because they're coming from him, but they're not rooted in any logic or really any precedent. So now folks are looking ahead to Tuesday, not just with a level of excitement and a hope of understanding how this will go, but anxiety too, and trepidation, and understanding who will actually win versus who takes the victory or claims victory on that night.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is really feeding a lot of fear because where you are in Washington, D.C., we've seen pictures of businesses being boarded up. There's clearly, a fear or at least anticipation that there might be some civil unrest regardless of which way the election might go. What is actually, what's the feeling on the ground in D.C.?
Well, I was in a downtown area of Washington on Friday, which is normally very bustling, very busy, lots of people going around. But between the virus and fears of potential civil unrest, a lot of the stores were boarded up. A lot of the windows for storefronts were protected, and folks were actively putting up protections for their businesses. And this is really something that we've never been through before as a country, the understanding that there might not be a peaceful transfer of power, whether it is from one Republican administration to a second or from a Republican administration to a Democratic one. There's an understanding and really a level of anxiety about how either side will react to a candidate's victory on Tuesday night or on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on how long it does take to count results.
All right, well, it'll be a fascinating week ahead in the United States. Maya King, thank you so much for your time here. Good luck with your coverage on the final few days of this campaign.
Thanks for having me.
Maya King there. And don't forget, ABC News will have special coverage of the US election on the 4th of November, starting at 6 a.m. with Lisa Miller and Michael Rowland in Washington for News Breakfast. On ABC and ABC News Channel from 10 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, Stan Grant, Ellen Fanning and David Spears will be joined by election guru Anthony Green and Casey Briggs, along with our US correspondents and special guests to analyse the results as they come in. Lee Sales hosts an ABC News special at 7 o'clock before Hamish McDonald and Julia Baird discuss some of the key issues that arise at the ballot box. Planet America has been the go-to destination for the 2020 election, and Chaz and John will have a special 2-hour show speaking to players from the Democratic and Republican camps. And rounding out the night, a special edition of The World with Beverly O'Connor. Well, let's turn our attention back home now and welcome our Monday political panel. New South Wales Labor frontbencher Stephen Jones and Queensland LNP Senator Susan McDonald have joined me now. Thank you both for joining the program.
Great to be with you.
Pleasure.
Well, let's start with you, Susan McDonald. Christine Holgate has stood down today, resigned as the Australia Post Chief Executive. Did she deserve to go over the luxury watches scandal?
I'm sorry, you're just breaking up a little bit, but I'm wondering if you said, did she deserve to resign?
I did.
Well, you know, Christine has made her own decisions about her future, but certainly I think that taxpayers right across Australia were really surprised by taxpayer funds being used in the way that they were. And it's something that we hold people to those standards very highly. And of course, here in Queensland, the performance of Australia Post during the last state election is something I've been really disappointed with. There are still people who haven't received their postal votes, and I think that disenfranchises regional and remote Australians, and I certainly was pretty disappointed with that.
The Prime Minister stood up in Parliament, Susan McDonald, and said that Christine Holgate had been told to stand aside, and if she didn't stand aside, well, then she could go. Now, her lawyers described that as humiliating. Was it appropriate for the Prime Minister to, you know, effectively kill off her career like that?
I think Australians were really shocked to discover that their taxpayer funds, the Australian government is the the shareholder of Australia Post, and that money was being spent on expensive watches, on accommodation, on things that we don't, you know, we don't think is reasonable. And so the Prime Minister, as the ultimate representative of the people, just said that very clearly. So yes, I think we hold people to high standards, and we expect particularly well-paid executives to live up to those standards.
Stephen Jones, I'm keen to get your thoughts on this. Has Christine Holgate done the right thing, and can we now draw a line under this whole watches fiasco?
Look, I think her resignation was inevitable. There's no doubt that Aussie Post is a mess at the moment. You've got postal services being cut at the same time as executives are being rewarded with expensive watches. But I've got to say, if this is the sort of punishment meted out to somebody for blowing $20,000, you know, a disgrace, but if this is the sort of punishment, what sort of punishment would be appropriate and fitting for blowing $27 million on a parcel of land that has been valued at $3 million? What sort of punishment should be meted out against the Prime Minister and his former sports minister for the sports rorts affairs, where money was being thrown around in coalition electorates against the advice of public servants, you know, extraordinary wastes of money, extraordinary breaches of protocols in place there. So I've got to say, if this is the standard that the Prime Minister is setting, then there's a lot of other people that should be very nervous, and it's a standard that he should be applying to himself as well.
Well, we know today the government has released draft legislation outlining the details of a new Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Just sticking with you, Stephen Jones, would this commission be able to investigate such allegations of corruption that are currently being levelled against the public servants involved in the Leppington Triangle land sale?
Look, the great problem with the announcement today is that it doesn't live up to its spin. Three problems that we can see with the announcement today, and we're still digging through some of the detail of this. And the first is the capacity of the Commission to investigate matters on its own motion. The second is its capacity to hold public hearings. And the third is its capacity to look at some of those retrospective matters, because, of course, as long as this is being delayed, more and more of these rorts are being exposed, and the capacity of these things to be investigated and appropriately punished by a body such as this is flowing past the wharf. So, we were hoping for something a lot better than we've got. Corruption hates sunlight. Instead of providing sunlight, they've provided shade cloth, and we need much more. So Labor won't be supporting a commission that doesn't do the job. We'll be engaging in the consultation process. But after 2 years, you would have thought the government could have done a lot better than this half-baked proposal.
Well, Susan McDonald, what is your response to that? Do you agree that perhaps this commission, as it's currently proposed, leans too far in favour of secrecy, as Stephen Jones was saying there?
No, I don't, and I think the confected outrage of the Labor Party is something that they've perfected over some time, and this is just another example. If he read the details carefully, he'd know that this commission will have greater powers to call people to hearings, to demand that they answer questions, and before they get really hot under the collar about the parcel of land at the Sydney airport, I think it's important to remember this has already been investigated by the AFP. This has already been referred to several groups for inquiry, and I don't think that anybody needs to worry that there's not going to be a very bright light shone on the practices within the department. We've already beat that around the head at estimates a couple of weeks ago, and it is just typical of Labor to huff and puff to try and make mountains out of molehills and not be productive and useful in moving forward, because this is the most significant time in Australia's history for probably the last 100 years. And we are working through an economic recovery for the nation after the COVID pandemic. And I think we would be better served looking to the future to make sure that Australians are well served in jobs, in homes and secure, rather than looking for, other issues.
Just on the Leppington Triangle land sale, Susan McDonald, I mean, I think one of the issues that was picked up was the difference in language and response. So when the Australia Post story broke, the Prime Minister said he was disgusted and appalled. But when the Leppington Triangle land sale story broke, the Deputy Prime Minister was still trying to insist that it might eventually be a bargain. I mean, I think Michael McCormack perhaps says, deserves a bit of criticism here for the way that he has responded to what were really significant allegations.
Well, I'm not sure what else could have been done. The Secretary has referred the department officials immediately for inquiry. He's referred it to the Australian Federal Police. I think that everything has been done appropriately as it should be, and frankly I'm more interested in actions rather than words.
All right, well, just returning to you, Stephen Jones, on the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. So the government is now going to spend 6 months in public consultations, so it doesn't look like this body is going to be, established anytime soon, but they're pretty significant powers that are being proposed here for the investigators, like tapping phones, searching properties, warrants, that kind of thing. So is it right for the government to be taking some time to actually consider the extent of these powers?
Look, they are run-of-the-mill sorts of powers that are provided to corruption investigating bodies all the way around the country. But I do want to return to this point that seems to be a point of disagreement between the two of us. The reason we have a strong body, the reason that we have public hearings, is because it sends a very clear message to those who may otherwise want to engage in corrupt behaviour. You better beware, because there is a strong watchdog and all of your behaviour can be dragged into public view. So the sorts of incidents that we saw around the grubby deal that appears to have been done around the Leppington Triangle, where $27 million worth of taxpayer money has been squandered, wouldn't occur, because the officials and the politicians involved would know that there is a very great risk that not only that this would be detected, but it would be exposed in the full public gaze. Now, we know what happens when this doesn't occur. And can I just drag you back 2 years to the Banking Royal Commission? And one of the key findings of the Banking Royal Commission was that they've had this culture in some of our financial regulators of laws being broken it all being discussed behind closed doors, a slap on the wrist being given, but no public gaze and no sunlight on those serious breaches of the law. So we have in our recent past a very good example about why we need public hearings, and it seems the government is addicted to secrecy, hates scrutiny, and they're going to set up a federal body that is going to reproduce all the problems of the past.
All right, well, Stephen Jones, just before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about an issue that you have been hotly pursuing, and that is the chair of the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, Helen Coonan. The Australian Financial Review has put out an editorial calling on her to resign because of the role that she also holds at Crown Casinos. Why do you think she should stand down?
Oh, look, her position is untenable. She's been on the Crown Casino board for 7 years, chairperson of that board for over a year. There has been a massive failure in governance, which goes to money laundering. That failure in governance has allowed criminal activity, including money laundering, to go on the premises of Crown Casino. In her own words, they've been inept, but that same person is chair on the body which oversees investigations into breaches of financial law in the financial sector, that is the Financial Complaints Authority. How can you have somebody who, by her own admission, has been inept in administering serious laws which apply to financial institutions, that is anti-money laundering laws? How can somebody who, by her own admission, has been inept be sitting in adjudication of those sorts of functions? It's just not tenable for her to continue. All
right, well, Susan McDonald, last word to you on this. Do you think that Helen Coonan is, has a massive conflict of interest here by serving on ACFA while also on the Crown Casinos board, given the revelations we've had recently?
Well, I think it's wildly premature to be speaking before an investigation's been completed. I don't, this is once again Labor's approach, is to come in wildly, shoot at anybody that's standing around and not actually listen to the facts, get to the bottom of it, understand that good government is good process, and that's what's happening at the moment. Helen Coonan has been a well-respected minister. She's a woman of great competence, and I think we should wait for the investigation to be completed. We don't just run around making wild accusations before an investigation's been complete. And Labor would tell you they want these commissions, they want additional powers and bodies, but they don't actually want them to do anything. They just want the opportunity to get on TV, again with a lot of confected outrage and huffing and puffing, but the serious business of running government and delivering for Australians in the middle of a pandemic, that's what we're about.
All right, Susan McDonald, Stephen Jones, thank you so much for your time today. Well, the Reserve Bank holds its monthly board meeting tomorrow, and economists are predicting it'll slash the already record low interest rate. Since March, the cash rate's sat at 0.25%. That was designed to encourage people to borrow and to keep some money pumping into the banking system. At the time, it was thought that was the lowest the RBA would go, but not so, according to some. Let's bring in Deloitte Access economics partner Chris Richardson. Chris, thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Jane.
Just to start on the RBA, what are you predicting they'll do tomorrow with regards to the cash rate?
They will be cutting rates, and basically there are a few rates at the moment in the system that sit at 0.25%, 0.25%. All of them will be going down to 0.1%. That's one thing they'll be doing, cutting rates. The other thing they'll be doing most probably is announcing that they'll be buying bonds. The idea there is a very strong signal to the market that interest rates in Australia stay low for a very long period of time. So it's not just short-term interest rates that will be low, but long-term interest rates as well.
And so why would the RBA be doing this? What is the goal here from the board?
I'd say a couple of things. One is to make the point that they are doing everything they can. Now, it's not a heap extra to cut interest rates, from record lows to super record lows, and there's not a whole lot that the banks can do in response. If interest rates are higher, what happens when the RBA cuts is that the banks cut for depositors. That gives them real room to give savings to the people that are borrowing from them. Not heaps here in this instance. The other thing the Reserve Bank would like to do, though, is give greater confidence to Australians who need it at the moment, and perhaps take a little bit of strength, if they can, out of the Australian dollar.
So the RBA obviously is responsible for the kind of monetary policy, and I think you have said before that they don't really have many more shots left in the locker. The fact that they are expected to lower rates again tomorrow, does that tell you something about perhaps their view of the fiscal policy, what the government's doing, the fact that the RBA feels like it needs to do more?
I would say it's more around confidence than necessarily a view on fiscal policy. But you are seeing, the key levers. The central bank, on the one hand, absolutely pedal to the metal around interest rates, and government with a big government deficit. There is potentially a case that the government will need to do more if either we fail to keep the virus numbers down, or if a vaccine turns out to be further away. Those sorts of things will be in the back of the mind of the Reserve Bank as well, but up front will be those confidence and exchange rate factors.
All right, well, Deloitte Access Economics has released a report today warning the Australian economy will lose $3 trillion over the next 50 years if climate change is not addressed. The government would argue that it is addressing climate change with its 2030 target. Is Deloitte suggesting that the policies as they stand are not sufficient?
What we would say is climate change is happening and that Australia will suffer more than the average. It already is. Basically, you get bigger impacts on nations with hotter climates. That's us. We also happen to have a population that lives squeezed against the coastline. That combination says we're more in the firing line. Other things equal, it also says the more that Australia does, the bigger the benefits. And to your question about policy, if we do more, there are greater benefits out there. Yes, the politics of this is really tricky. How we've tried to address that is, the problem number one is most of these reports begin with, if climate change is happening, then this, then that. We've gone on the front foot and said, well, yes, climate change is happening. And the more, therefore, that we react to it, that we fight it, there's benefits for all sorts of people out there.
All right, Chris Richardson, we have run out of time, unfortunately, but thanks for joining the program today.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, well, that is afternoon briefing for today. More on our top stories up next. Stay with us here on ABC News. We'll be digging further into the Commonwealth's announcement today of a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, coming up just after 5 o'clock on ABC News.